A complete old building is like a beautiful smile. As time goes by and pieces become missing, it begins to lose its smile. As a preservationist, my hope is to help return a missing piece and bring back its smile. My name is Donnie Miller, and I'm an artist blacksmith. I've been an artist blacksmith for about 15 years. What got me interested in this was probably welding. I started off, a lot of people say welding is the gateway drug to blacksmithing. I started off making artistic metal furniture, but it was kind of lifeless. It had no soul, and I wanted to give it some texture with an anvil and hammer. So about 25 years ago or so, I had a loft down in Detroit, and I wanted to make artistic metal furniture for my loft. I had a stainless steel coffee table, and I was kind of going for that Manhattan kind of look, big steel canopy bed, that kind of thing. But I wanted to make curved, sexy table legs, and I was like, how do you move metal? You know, I got a torch, I started beating on it, and I was making crude curves, but I kept getting the steel hotter and hotter in order to get those smooth lines, and that's when the spark went off, so to speak, you know, pun intended. Fast forward a dozen years or so, and I bought a 100-year-old house. The city council said that I had to put a handrail on there because I had more than 3 steps. I actually fought the city council. I said, this house has been around for over 100 years. Why do I need handrails now? And they said, well, we need to learn from our past mistakes. And I couldn't imagine putting a box tubing railing on there. It's long before I was ever a blacksmith, but I was looking for something that was handmade, you know. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s, I think, that I really had found the appreciation for handmade things, you know, the pottery with the little thumbprint in it, and you know the little nuances that showed that it was made by hand and not just a machine, you know. There aren't a lot of college courses anymore for blacksmithing. There are a few in the area. There aren't a lot of traditional apprenticeships either. So how does one go about doing it? Because of shows like Forge and Fire, there is a little bit of a resurgence, and some places are popping up. There are folk schools like John C. Campbell in North Carolina, or Tillers International out in Kalamazoo, where they teach basket weaving and glass blowing and forging, blacksmithing as well. And now here, I'm trying to teach classes here as well. So there are opportunities out there. You just gotta look for them, I guess. I mainly started here, drove by and saw an anvil on the side of the building, and just literally knocked on the door and just said, hey, what do you guys do here? Just out of curiosity. It was like 8 o'clock at night and the shop was still open. I was like, this is, you know, strange in this neighborhood, you know. And they said, well, come on in, we'll show you, you know. And they really just took me under their wings, you know, said, here's a hammer and anvil, and go nuts. So I struggled with leaves for the longest time until I made one out of copper. And then I could really see the metal move. It's not glowing orange in your face like steel. You get the copper up to a dull red, and it instantly turns to like a gray, silvery color, more like silly putty. So you can really see every single hammer mark. It's like working with clay. It's a really good teaching, learning tool. And after I made one out of copper, I was like, oh, the light bulb really went off, and it translates, it went back. So when I made one out of steel immediately after, and I headed down, you know. My mind was blown, honestly, you know. Once you first see it, like, the possibilities are limitless. It's just endless. Anything you can do with clay or wood, you can do with steel, you know. You just gotta get it 2,000 degrees, hit it with a hammer. You know, you can't touch it, but you can move it in any way. The steel will do whatever you tell it to do. Taking a cold, dead, raw piece of material off the rack and bringing life into it, you know, shaping it into something that's free-formed, flowing, organic, botanical looking, you know, just with hammer and anvil and steel, and it ignites a fire, you know, for sure. So there are literally thousands of different types of steels nowadays. So when you look at all the different grades of steel, there are different letter number designations. The first 2 numbers will usually stand for the series, and the second 2 numbers will stand for the points of carbon. So 1095 is a 10 series, which means it has X amount of sulfur and manganese and all the different types, whatever. And the other two numbers will designate the carbon, so it's up to 0.95% carbon, so it's a high carbon steel. 15N20, that N means there's nickel in it. S7 means it's shock resistant. W1 is water hardening. O1 is oil hardening. There are also air hardening steels, heat treatable, H13. I could go on and on like it never ends, literally. I don't do a lot of repurposing. I will use maybe some railroad spikes or something like that, but the majority of found steels you find in a scrapyard or a junkyard, they're there for a reason. You know, if they might have a micro crack in it, it might not show up until later on. A lot of guys will use a garage door spring or a leaf spring from cars. 5160, if it's got 60 points of carbon, it can hold an edge so you can make a decent blade out of it. But again, if they found it in the junkyard, it's there for a reason. You know, you might be able to repurpose it, you might not. And those cracks might not show up until you're the final quench, you know, and then you realize, oh, you just wasted all that time, you know. So if you can start with new steel, you're better off. You know what's in it, you know. 4140, 1095, 15N20, all those little numbers and letters designate something, you know. Most mild steel is very forgiving. You can work the steel anywhere from 1200 to 2300 degrees, anywhere in that wide range. Some tool steels you have a very short window of opportunity. Any hotter or colder, you know, between 1800 and 2000 degrees, you're gonna ruin the integrity of the steel. You're gonna stress crack it one way or another. There's an old-timey process called just spark testing, where you hold a piece of steel up against a grinder and read the sparks. And if it's got red or white streaks, it indicates alloys. The more sparks, the more carbon there is. But it's kind of an outdated process nowadays because there are so many new different types of steels, you know. In a historic home or building, blacksmiths typically made all the hinges for all the doors and cabinets, curtain tiebacks and shutter dogs for windows, door handles and drawer pulls, all the hardware. If it was made of metal, it came from the blacksmith. As an example of that, I was once told that when people were moving across the prairies, they would actually burn down wooden structures just to save the nails because they were that valuable, because they had to be made handmade by a blacksmith. Unfortunately, I'm not sure where the blacksmith's role is now with modern machinery, as far as making utilitarian things like nails and horseshoes and boot scrapers. It's more ornamental or decorative ironwork, you know, the more luxury house jewelry kind of things, you know. The utilitarian stuff can be stamped or laser cut, plasma by a machine much faster than it can be done by hand. So unless someone's willing to pay for having something done by hand, you know, 9 times out of 10 you can buy 2 or 3 of something, you know, for the same price as one. Typically the hardest part with working with a client on a custom piece is narrowing it down because there are so many different possibilities. So I typically recommend them just looking online or through books for inspiration and pulling different elements from different pieces or different areas to incorporate into their design. And then from there, breaking it down to time and materials, how long will this actually take, and kind of coaching them on it, you know, as well, and narrowing down their budget. Unfortunately, it usually has a factor in it, you know, because I can make it as ornate as you can imagine, you know. I could spend hours and hours just chiseling lines through it and making it decorative and ornamental. Or it could be clean cut, modern, straight lines, mainly more fabricated, you know, maybe with some hammered texture. Call it blacksmithing, it's textured fabrication, you know. Or it could be all traditional joinery, slit and drift, mortise and tenon, pass-throughs, forge welds, you know, no electrical or modern machinery used whatsoever, all done by hand if they're a purist and they're willing to pay for that time and, you know, skill that it takes to do it, I guess. So knowing the age of the home does really help, obviously. You can usually tell what era the steel or the ornamental ironwork came from. Based on the heavy texture, it'll look more Gothic or medieval versus flowing lines, it'll be more Art Nouveau. If it's early 19th century arts and crafts versus a castle, you know, you can kind of gear the ironwork towards that era. There's colonial ironwork a lot, which is like ram's horns and hearts, more Pennsylvania Dutch looking, you know. So over the years of me doing this, I've made a lot of different pieces that I'm very proud of. Originally, I was really into the Gothic medieval kind of look. Since then, I've kind of transitioned more into organic, botanical ironwork, making leaves and sculptures. I just did a sculpture for a nature center that's got a dragonfly and a butterfly and a, you know, whatever else. I really like the organic ironwork because there are no tolerances. It doesn't have to be perfectly 90 degrees, plush, plumb all the way around. It's more whimsical, you know. In the past, I've used a lot of mixed metals, copper and steel mixed together, like you saw the mailbox over there and the coat rack that we mentioned. Yeah, the best thing about blacksmithing really is that you can make your own tools. And I've always said if you can make your own tools, you can do anything. The majority of my work, 90% of it, is done with a 2.5 pound cross-peen hammer and a variety of tongs, punches, and chisels. You can never have too many tongs because you're going to hold different shapes with those different tongs. The first set of punches and chisels that I made were out of rebar. They still hold an edge today. It's repurposing, but a lot of the tongs that I use today were also handmade. There are a variety of tools needed in blacksmithing. With hammers alone, there are anything from a 1 pound ball peen to the 2.5 pound cross peen to a 4 pound sledge and everything in between. A lot of horseshoers use rounding hammers nowadays, where it's flat on one side and rounded on the other. To get a nice curved shape. The majority of my work is done with a cross-peen hammer. We've got about half a dozen different anvils set up, and not all anvils are created equal by any means. The chain wrapped around the anvil is to deaden the ring. A lot of anvils are very noisy. A lot of old-timer blacksmiths are hard of hearing because of that ting, ting, ting all day. So that one there, one of the techniques we use is wrapping a chain around an anvil to deaden the ring. Other people use speaker magnets underneath the heel, that will help, or put a sheet of lead or even a roofing shingle underneath the anvil and sock it down to a nice hardwood stump. That'll hopefully deaden the ring a little bit. We've got a couple different power hammers over here set up. One is a pretty classic, the original. It's a 25 pound mechanical. It's called a Little Giant. We've also had a couple bigger air hammers here. Nazel is a big name, and the other one is a 75 pound steam hammer that's been converted to air. Some of the power hammers do date back to the 1800s, mid to late 1800s, somewhere in there. They had old steam helve style hammers, you know, and they've since obviously come up with newer, fancy versions of it, you know. Blacksmithing on a whole is a dying art. There is a bit of a resurgence in it now. For better or for worse, a lot of it is in blade smithing or knife making. I wish there was a little bit more of a resurgence in ornamental ironwork. There are amazing gates and ironwork that date back hundreds of years that are all traditional joinery. They didn't have a drill press, they didn't have an arc welder, they did it all with hammer and anvil, and some of it is just mind-boggling how they were able to do it. It's like the pyramids, you know? How did they do that with the technology that they had back then? It's incredible, you know? I can't recommend it enough. Working with your hands and learning what it's like to forge steel and come away with something that's tangible at the end of the day. To get dirty, to feel that soot in your lungs and the stresses in your back and the muscles in your shoulders, and I don't know, get away from the phone thing that, you know, we're so stuck in a digital society nowadays that we're trapped, you know, and there's no better feeling at the end of the day, like I said, than creating something with your hands that's gonna outlive you, you know. It sounds cliche, but I'm not sure if I chose blacksmithing or if it chose me, you know. It kind of just fell into it, you know. I had no plans on ever becoming a blacksmith. I never thought as a child, like, oh, that's what I want to be, you know. I just knew I wanted to work with my hands. I wanted to be creative. I really liked working with metal, and like I said, nowadays a lot of the metal work is just lifeless, you know. It has no soul, you know. Once you put it through the fire and actually beat it with hammer and anvil, it breathes life into it, and just ignites something, you know.